Let's talk about aperture. Aperture is the diameter of an opening inside the lens that controls the amount of light reaching the sensor in the camera, okay? Or the film in an actual film camera. Basically, you have a lens and there's a little bitty opening in the middle of it, and it can be wider, or it can be smaller, and that is the aperture. And the aperture is a mechanical way of controlling the amount of light hitting the sensor in a camera. And the aperture is actually determined in settings called f-stops. Set your aperture. That is your iris opening on your lens. 2 stops from wide open. And you know, the larger your aperture, which means the lower the f-stops, the more limited depth of field you're going to have. But the problem is, when you open up your aperture, the brightness gets too bright, and you have a tendency to overdrive the sensor in your camera, and so consequently you're opening the aperture to get the limited depth of field, but the scene's too bright, and so what you do is you get a variable ND filter, and you put a variable ND filter on the front of your lens, and so your ND filter, your neutral density filter, controls the amount of light going into your lens, just like the aperture. But the aperture allows you to control your depth of field, whereas the ND filter just decreases the brightness. So you can take your aperture up to allow you to have a lot of light coming in, and the effect where you have a very narrow depth of field where you get the person in focus and everything in the back's out of focus, and you adjust your ND filter to be a little bit more dense where less light is coming through on the front of the lens, and that way you can get your light level correct where the camera isn't being overdriven by bright light, and your sensor is not blooming, doesn't have areas that are blooming, and you can actually achieve a more base recording, something that isn't like overdriven, where when you can go into post and you can expand the flat recording back out and get a lot better look in with color correction and brightness correction in post than you would if you were to try and do that with the camera. And so a variable ND filter is like a necessity when you're going to be doing cinematic shooting, especially in outdoor situations.